Thanks for joining us. I'll keep it fairly brief. Again, I'm Dan Siciliano, Faculty Director of the Rock Center. I teach venture capital and finance here. But I led a secret life as an entrepreneur, having only just sold a company that we managed to get angel financed, but chose not to be VC financed in 2001, and we sold at the end of 2012 to PNC Bank. So I will, be hard pressed to resist jumping in periodically. I think I've learned most of the points we'll make by having done them wrong in the first place. But to start off, let me just do some quick introductions. On our website, rockcenter.stanford.edu, you'll be able to find the more full detailed bios here. But let me start out with Miriam Rivera, who's on our panel. We're very lucky to have Miriam. She is what I like to refer to as the quad alumni. That is, she has 4 different degrees from Stanford, a bachelor's, a master's, a JD, and an MBA. She is in some circles best known as the person who was one of the early people to join Google, helped to build its legal team, helped to design and implement many innovative structures that are still an essential element of Google's success, and was part of the person who built the team that helped Google be named as in 2011, one of the best corporate legal teams in America. She has more awards than I could possibly mention. If you can think of a list that says people of influence, women of influence, Latinas of influence. She's either gotten the award for the year or been listed on that multiple times. Most recently, she is the managing member and co-founder of Ulu Ventures, and also is the co-founder and president of Stanford's Angels and Entrepreneurs. I could go on longer. You should go and read her bio on the website. It is a remarkable read. I'm also happy to introduce Clint Corver. And Miriam and Clint have the same problem sometimes that my wife and I have, where she's Kristen Major from Deputy General Counsel at HP, and I'm Dan Siciliano, and then people think I'm the creepy guy because after I have my arm around her. Well, Clint and Miriam are married, as it happens, and so I always like to point that out so you won't think, what's Clint doing holding Miriam's hand? How odd, right? So, but Clint comes to this field with expertise entirely in his own right. Right now, he's COO of Novo Ed, which he might describe a little bit more. They're doing some exciting stuff with online education. He is a lecturer, as Evan mentioned, in the Stanford Technology Ventures Program, STVP, and is also one of the co-founders of Ulu Ventures. He managed to get only 2 degrees from Stanford, so he has a master's and a PhD, and he has a BA in mathematics from Grinnell, where he also chairs their board of trustees. And he has a lot of other startup and successful entrepreneurial work under his belt. We have 2 sitting CEOs with us today as well, so I'm happy to introduce them. So first, let me introduce Anthony Suhu. Anthony is co-founder and CEO of Dot and Bow. Am I saying that right? Great. And which is a new online entertainment commerce company, venture-backed, based out of San Francisco. Previously, he was senior vice president at CBS Corporation because Dot Spotter, another company that he was CEO of and co-founder, had been acquired by them. Prior to that, he served in another startup that he was the CEO and co-founder, which was acquired by Yahoo, where he then served as a vice president, and he spent time at Apple and a lot of other Bay Area companies. He went to the wrong school, unfortunately, as his MBA from Harvard, but we gave him a day pass, so it's okay. And until very recently, he served on the board of directors of Revision 3, which was acquired by Discovery Communications. And last but not least, we have Bob Weinschenk, who is the CEO of a Stanford-related spin-out company called Sipix. He's the chief executive officer there, but previous to that, he was CEO of a company called Smarty Pig. You can read all about it on the website. He was co-founder and chief executive officer of Barfly Interactive Networks, and then before that, Brightstream Networks. And then finally, he was president and CEO of Pixum. If I didn't know how successful you were, I'd accuse you of not being able to keep a job. Apparently, you found, run, and then sell, and then move on. But that's the dream of the best entrepreneurs in the Valley. So with that, why don't I kind of just jump straight into our first and broad question. This is a topic that deserves several sessions, so we hope with Evan Epstein's hard work and cooperation of people like our panelists today, we'll be bringing you more sessions on this topic. So we won't manage to get to everything, but we're going to try to tackle 3 core areas. And those areas are the basics of assembling and running a successful startup board, some of the best practices about what those board meetings look like and how communications look like, and then finally, some of the places where people trip up, maybe some known problems and things to avoid. So with that, let me start maybe with Miriam, if you're willing, with a very open-ended question on the formalities. We are a law school, by the way, so here's a loaded question, which is, a lot of entrepreneurs resist the legal formalities in the earliest stages of startup ventures, including the formations in the corporate form and the like. Why is this a mistake, do you think? And can you maybe expand a little bit on some of the key issues that people need to pay attention to?
I'm going to focus on the formation piece first, but basically trying to set up your organization in the right format to be able to accept different kinds of financings is one of the reasons why you have to make a decision between an LLC and a C Corp or an S Corp, and you want to be able to have a practicing attorney help guide you through the thought process behind what you're doing. Different kinds of companies are subject to different tax advantages for certain kinds of investors depending on how you formed your company to begin with. So if you are looking at getting venture capital, which a lot of people think they want, then you want to try to structure your company in a particular way to advantage that kind of investor. The other things that a lot of, and I'm going to speak at a pretty high level because I know there's a lot of students in the audience too, and they may not have any experience with starting a company or with starting a board, and so I think it's important for them to kind of understand just some of the real basic reasons why you want to be careful in setting up a legal structure for your company. Also, one of the things that happens a lot in the real world here is that people start working together on a company idea without any entities, and they create intellectual property together, and the intellectual property has no home. It's essentially the home of the individual people, and so therefore until there's an entity and that IP is transferred to the entity, it's unclear who owns and what the benefits may be that derive from that intellectual property. This has derailed many a startup company, including ones that I have invested in, where later on the people that founded a company together can't agree on what percentage ownership they should have for their different contributions that they made at a time when they were not an entity. And therefore, they couldn't seek investment, or if they had gotten investment, the investment literally fell apart on the basis of not being able to apportion appropriately between the founders. In addition, when you're starting a board, you're required under state law to have a board. Typically, the founders themselves serve as board members until they actually either get investment from outsiders or until they get advisors that are willing to serve in some sort of quasi-board capacity. And the initial reason for this is that you actually have certain requirements to file certain documentation with the state. And in order to maintain your legal status as an entity, you're required to actually engage in some level of formality regarding board meetings and to have officers and have those officers named to the state where you're setting up your operation or where you're doing business if you're set up in a different state and are resident in another. And the things that I think a lot of people don't really get about this is that there is a certain amount of self-protection that you're involved in as a startup person by actually practicing the formalities. Under corporate law, there is a doctrine that's called piercing the corporate veil, which means that if you don't engage in proper governance and you don't actually have meetings and you treat monies that you might have received from other people as if it were your own personal bank account and there's not very good accounting for it, people who are creditors of your company or people who have been injured by your company can actually pursue not just the company but yourself as an individual. And for a lot of young startup people, well, they think, well, I don't have anything anyway. I'm eating ramen, so it's no big deal. But the other thing is that you're unable to attract real board members that could potentially add value if you're not engaging in some level of proper accounting for monies that you're bringing in, because many of them have homes or other kinds of assets they would like to keep. So your failure to do this actually can detract from the, what your company is to them in terms of something where they're willing to put their own personal assets at risk, because directors of companies, even private companies, can be held liable as well for the acts of a company if they have not overseen these formalities. So those are some of the initial reasons why you may want to take care with these formalities and not treat them as just, heinous housekeeping that you don't really want to do. And the same goes with things like D&O insurance. As you receive investment from either sophisticated or wealthy angel investors or VCs, there'll typically be some sort of requirement that you get a policy for D&O insurance, and that is to cover any costs that may happen as a result of litigation against the officers, meaning yourselves as well, and or directors in the company. And this happens more than you would think. There are cases in California, for example, where minority shareholders in one series are suing the company for perhaps not watching out for their interests and allowing other majority shareholders to be advantaged in some way that they believe is unfair to the minority shareholders. And then oftentimes the officers, meaning the CEO and members of the board, are sued in that personally. And you'd like to have some insurance to cover the legal costs, because in our country, the American rule is that he who is sued pays for the cost of fighting and defending the lawsuit, unlike the British rule, where oftentimes it's the person who's bringing the lawsuit. If they lose, they pay for the cost of the defense.
Before I ask a follow-up to that, Miriam, let me just define, in case some people didn't know, D&O just stands for Directors and Officers Insurance. It's its own special type of insurance. It's underwritten differently. So even if you go get an insurance policy, it probably is not a D&O insurance policy unless you've purchased that specifically. So D&O stands for Directors and Officers. Maybe I'll direct this at Clint, though, if other people want to volunteer. So Miriam outlines this, clear need for following formalities. Sounds like giving some lawyers some good work, paying some legal bills, getting stuff done. And a lot of entrepreneurs, and even some, I would say, folks on the funding side will often wave their hands and say, yeah, that's just housekeeping, right? Ignore the housekeeping, pay someone to take care of it, don't lose any sleep, build your product, build your company, move forward. Don't really pay much attention to the housekeeping. I think we all roughly agree that it's not just housekeeping, it's more foundational. What points or what arguments should an entrepreneur make in favor of this is foundational, not just simple housekeeping? Do you mind?
Sure, yeah. So first of all, before I say anything, one caveat. So I'm not an attorney. And by the way, when I give advice like on boards and so forth, I always make sure there's an attorney there, because there's often Clint, you can't do that. So, so I'm going to give you, call it the scrappy entrepreneur version of it. In my mind, there's two primary roles for a board. One is governance, which is a lot of the legal stuff, and the other is guidance. And if you look at public companies, it's mostly about governance. Whereas in the very early startup roles, in my mind, it's mostly about guidance. So in that sense, you don't necessarily need a formal board to get the guidance that you need. However, a formal board structure can help you basically pull in the kinds of people that have the guidance you would want. So in my mind, like when I work with early stage startups, and what we talk about in my course is how do you get the guidance you need? And by the way, this varies dramatically. So Bob's not going to need much guidance when he starts his next company. Whereas somebody coming fresh out of Stanford is probably going to need a lot of guidance. So the amount of structure that you have to put in place, I think, is often a function of what it takes to bring the guidance to you. Now, the other thing I'd say early on is don't screw up the governance. So in some ways, when you hit that first round of funding, the professional investors will help you clean stuff up, assuming you haven't screwed something up so badly that one of your founders walks away or the company kind of falls apart. And just one kind of fun failure story in that. One of our early investments was in a company where there were two founders. One founder was the CEO and the other founder was the president. So anytime there was a disagreement, the CEO basically called the shots. However, they had a board where both of them were on the board. The president got 2 votes, the CEO got 1 vote on the board. So you can imagine how this is going to play out, right? So the president wants to do something, the CEO says, no, we're not going to do that. The president calls a board meeting. That did not end well. So that would be an example of screwing up governance. And if you do that early on before the investors can help you out, you're pretty much sunk once the point where the relationships get, not repairable.
I think we'll circle back around to what inevitably becomes some of the difficult conversations at the earliest stages of company formation around, it sounds like, either the president or the CEO, they should have sat down and said, okay, we've got to sort this out now in a better way. But we'll come back to that, I think. Maybe let me shift gears. We said that the formalities matter. You got to get the governance right in a way to attract the right people to give you the guidance. And assuming that you have the right people on board to give you guidance, it's still, from the evidence, if you look back at both successful and unsuccessful startups, there are many points along the way in which board members and founder CEOs, their incentives are not perfectly aligned. And that's kind of putting it the nice way, right? Sometimes they diverge significantly. So maybe, let me turn to Bob, if that's okay. Can you talk to us a little bit about these inherent conflicts of interest, which I think is a story that is fairly well talked about in the kind of, the press and also on blogs, about the conflicts between CEO founders and maybe their venture funding board members and others. And then I'm going to go back to Miriam for like a different take on that. But can you talk about those conflicts and maybe how you've managed them or avoided them, or I don't know, is there a secret method?
If there is, I'm hoping to learn it.
I was trying, sorry.
So I would say that the conflicts, I would say just go back to the tension that happens within any team. You do a project with a friend, does it always go well? Then you start to add some monetary challenges there, and you start putting some pressure, and it starts to break apart pretty quickly. So I would say that the conflict starts right at the founding of a company. Are all the founders, do you all have the same socioeconomic interests? Very often that's not the case, and if you're not discussing that before you found the company, somebody wants to sell it for $3 trillion, and somebody's just happy to get a few dollars to pay for that ramen. So I think some of the tensions start out right from the beginning of a company, never mind who's going to be the CEO, which is the fast way to cripple a company. You never even have a chance to form a board. And I'm not a fan of everybody gets a tie vote. Then you start to add in, venture. And venture is not just venture. When you're raising money, it matters whether that venture company just opened their fund or whether it's 5 years into a 6-year fund. Their investment objectives will dramatically change. If you're about to close a fund, they want a return. If the venture fund's not doing very well and you're their last investment, they're going to hold out to let you run it as far as they can. They're benefited by doing that to raise their next fund.
Can you expand on that a little bit? Because I think a lot of us know what you said, but some people may not have enough background. So if you're their last chance to make the returns on their fund, and you being the company, and you have, for example, an offer that comes in, and maybe the founders who were students 2 years ago and are thinking, wow, a couple $1 million, that's a whole lot of money. That's life transforming for me. But what you're describing is potentially that the venture fund may not see that, so they would hold out. What does that mean? What does it mean to hold out, and how does that?
Oh, absolutely. On a board, it's a vote. So when you're sitting down there aligning yourself with your venture capitalists, I can say that for SIPX, we all sat down beforehand and talked about different opportunities for the company, different capital raising scenarios, and different returns on those capital raising scenarios. And we all looked at each other and said, if we do this, is that a win? We want to vote. Not a formal vote, but I want to know that before. Because if somebody thinks you're building a $3 trillion business and somebody thinks you're building a $100 million business, you're going to have a conflict on the board. So the VCs, I think it's a really important thing to understand when you raise money, what is the stage of that venture fund? A fund lasts a certain period, and then they move to another fund. The venture fund will act differently depending on what stage you are in their investment cycle. And I think people miss that very often.
One thing to add to that is, besides just the venture fund itself, it's actually the partners or the venture capitalists inside that fund. Because if you actually have a partner who is trying to either, if it's a principal or if it's someone trying to make partner, or they've had actually a crappy portfolio while the fund's actually overall done great, you're going to get a certain different type of behavior. And then I can also cite, a recent example where there's a company that actually, there's a person that sat on a board of a company that's about to go public. Private company, they're going to go public. But they did not want the financials actually for this company to be disclosed because it would ruin the financing opportunities for two of his other investments inside his fund. Now that is not actually acting in the best interest of the individual company, and the advice he was getting was wait until a few quarters out because you want to see this thing through. But it became pretty apparent as you kind of played the thing out that his interest was actually protecting his other two investments, that they could get their funding round before a company actually went out and went public. So,
and these are the stories that we hear a lot. I think if you read about entrepreneurs and their anxieties and their experiences, this comes out a lot. So I have two questions, and I think, Miriam, I want you to take a bite at both. So one is, all of this sounds very inside baseball. It sounds complicated. It sounds hard to manage, hard to learn about. Where can entrepreneurs go, do you think, to get consistent, informed, objective advice about this? Like, who would they turn to hear what Bob and Anthony had to say about, hey, this is what happens when this type of VC partner or principal ends up on your board and plays out? Where did they get that advice?
Well, I definitely think that other CEOs of venture-backed companies is your best networking to understand, and there are websites that you can go to as well that talk about venture capitalists and the experiences that different companies have had with them. And, in all honesty, I think that you get pretty good advice from real CEOs because many of them understand the differences that they have with their VCs. So, you'll hear about somebody who felt that he was forced to sell his company prematurely because they wanted an exit. The VCs wanted an exit. They wanted to put some big numbers on the board, and they were at a point where they could do that, but that wasn't necessarily what the CEO wanted to do. But by this point, he didn't have enough votes on the board to be able to stop a sale of the company. So that's an example where that conflict happens from the VC perspective. Now, there are also conflicts that happen with the CEO having sometimes personal interest at selling at different points because his or her stock may be worth more under certain scenarios than other scenarios, and other investors wanting to wait for a potential bigger return in the future, or having to have a sale price at a certain point so that if there are any provisions that basically would pay more to certain investors that have multiples that they get paid before anyone else gets paid, then the other investors are going to want a higher price, but the CEO may or may not want to fight for it depending on what his or her outcomes are at different valuations. So there are a lot of potentials for conflicts on both sides of the table, and from the perspective of the CEO is also an individual, a stockholder, a person who might have a mortgage, a child, expenses, and they may sometimes not want to take some of the risks that the VCs would want to take with the company in terms of trying to go bigger and get a bigger exit downstream. I think some of the other sources are, I do think that you should speak with counsel that have experience working with multiple companies about some of these kinds of conflicts of interest. But I think it's hard to get the real feeling for it unless you're speaking with somebody who's similarly situated and has kind of been there and walked in your shoes. And then you can hear all different versions of the good and the bad and the ugly. And I think that that's going to help you if you spend that time and invest that time to actually talk to real CEOs.
Great. I'm just going to keep us moving forward in the interest of time so that we do have time for questions at the end. I think, Clint, you had previously in our conversations described one of the ways you go about assembling a great board. So you already alluded to one piece of it, which was get the governance right, per Miriam's suggestion, make sure you have D&O insurance and other things so that you can attract the right people. But beyond that, how do you go about making sure that who you put onto the board plays out, and what controls that? I make it sound as if it's completely within your control as a founder CEO, but I don't think that's quite the case.
Yeah, well, so I think this is very relevant to your capitalization strategy. So if you need venture capital funding, for example, they're going to have a big say in how your board comes together. And by the way, that's one of the reasons why some entrepreneurs choose not to seek venture capital funding, because they don't want somebody telling them how they run their business. So that's one thing. So you got to figure out, basically, which world are you in, and that depends on capitalization. So let's say you're in the world where you don't have VCs around. So you've got a lot more control over how this thing gets put together. So in my mind, the kind of board members you want are the ones that are going to be useful to you and aligned with you. So useful to you in the sense that, you know, they complement your skill set, they can make the introductions that are helpful, they have the kind of experience that is really going to help you out. And by the way, I think a lot of entrepreneurs, especially first-time entrepreneurs, tend to shoot for big names as opposed to people who can really be useful. So from my point of view, you know, pick the CEO of a Fortune 500 company. Yeah, that'd be great to have on your board, but they probably don't know much about a startup really. As opposed to someone who is maybe a couple of steps ahead of you in the startup game, and they've raised a couple of rounds of VC funding, and you know they've gone through all the challenges of a 5-person company and a 10-person company and a 20-person company. I think that person is far more useful on a startup board than the Fortune 500 CEO. Now on alignment, this gets a little bit to what Bob was saying. It's like you want to make sure that your objectives for the company are aligned with who's ever on your board. Because the person that's on your board, if they're really on your board, they're going to have a huge influence over your ability to do especially risky things. So a risky thing could be, for example, anytime you raise capital, it's somewhat risky. Anytime you make big investments, that's somewhat risky. And so you want to make sure you're aligned that way. And I actually think it's, for most people that are, my preference, I like to sort of try before you buy, if you will. So if you find somebody that is I think would be a good board member, find a way to do some work with them for a while first, either in an advisory board capacity or some other project. And to basically, figure these things out. It's interesting. One other thing I mentioned. So there's a book called "Build It to $1 Billion." Anybody heard of that? I forget the author. It was a person in McKinsey. Basically went and studied what was it that made these companies like Google and Yahoo and eBay go from 0 to $1 billion so quickly when so many others didn't. And he came up. I'm blanking on the guy's name right now, but he came up with 7 factors. And one of the factors was a board that was really useful. And he went into actually some detail into what makes for a useful board. And it turns out lots of venture capitalists tends not to be correlated with $1 billion company. What tends to be correlated with $1 billion company is actually customer and partner representation on your board. That's the perspective that you really need to understand. And if you get that at the board level, good things can happen.
One thing to add to that is that I agree completely with what Clint said. I think that a lot of the early stage entrepreneurs that I see, they start companies, and when they form their board, typically they're thinking about it in terms of forming their board for fundraising purposes versus a company building purpose. And I think that is probably the biggest flaw in that whole process, because when you consider a board member, funding, while important for a company, is a stage of evolution of a company. It's not the end be all of that company. So when you kind of map out all the things of skill sets, I think I found it to be helpful in terms of with my team, to highlight all the things that we think we know, all the things we think are potential pitfalls, which are lied, and all the blind spots we potentially have, and then we try to fill out all the blind spots that we have with either advisory board members that we try out initially that potentially can become board members. We found it to be a better process, and we have always thought that trying to find someone for a temporary fix for fundraising never works, at least with every company that I've seen so far.
So you've both mentioned advisory boards, and maybe if Bob or Anthony, I know you both mentioned it to me previously, can you tease out the differences? Legally, the differences are pretty profound, and we can maybe circle back around to that, but can you tell us about, have you used advisory boards? How did that work differently from a more formal board?
Sure. Well, I think the advisory board is, to me, it's the next level down. It's filling in the gaps, the small crevices that you still have after your board. There's always somebody out there with additional expertise that is valuable, that has interest. We had, not to drop a name, for Pixum, which was a digital imaging company out of Stanford, we had Francis Ford Coppola on our board. And ironically, he was able to open up doors for us that within the movie industry that were very unique. And actually became a very valuable advisory board member. He was not interested in a board role, did not have the time or anything else. But relative to that specific area, he opened up that market like nobody else did. So again, it's that very specific person that comes in. And again, I always view any advisor as, can they change the course of your company disruptively with a phone call? And if they can't do that, you can probably get the advice cheaper. But if you're going to bring somebody on and invest in them, and make sure they know what's going on in the company, I think you really have to look carefully, make sure you try to buy. Because, boy, once that person's on, whether it be a board or an advisory board, it's tough to say thanks but no thanks. But once they're on, boy, if they can make that phone call, I've seen it happen. It's amazing.
Let me ask a specific question, Anthony. You had mentioned in a previous conversation that you view the advisory board as transitory. It evolves quickly. It changes. Is there a tactical strategy you use to set the stage for that? Because my experience has been advisory boards are very sticky. Like someone's on an advisory board, it is awkward and uncomfortable to move them off. You know, you audition them, you realize they're never going to be on the board, and then you realize maybe you misestimated their value. What have you done to be able to make it transitory?
So what we've typically found is that for actual board of directors, they're very formal. It's part of, for instance, our funding agreements in terms of the people that actually join our boards, et cetera. What we have found with advisory board members is that typically, in terms of the growth of our company and as it has evolved, the useful life of one advisor is typically between 3 to 6 months. And we've structured advisory board agreements where we give them shares of our company for 3 to 6 months, and then we kind of rotate people through. If there's people that we believe have more value, we renew their advisory agreement. And I think that most of that stuff is mainly dependent on the stage of our company. So a lot of times, I just want them to have a little stake in the game of why I'm actually using them as an advisory board member. But I have always kind of considered them a lot more temporal, and just depending on what I need at the moment.
Well, your mechanism speaks back to what Miriam pointed out, which is it required a certain amount of formality. So it sounds like it's built into your advisory board agreement, and that's the structural method you use.
Yeah, one thing I didn't want to say, because I didn't want to interrupt Miriam, is that you should form this stuff on day one, if not day zero, because there is enough wide open space that you need some guardrails on. And while you're building up the value of the company, everyone starts thinking, once they lift their pen, that they've added X amount of value. And everyone's perception of that is so different that unless you can agree to it on day one, you're never going to get agreement on it day 10. And
that assumes you're all still getting along.
Yes,
and then it's hard.
And the funny thing is, when you start these companies, since I think most of us have done this a few times, nothing goes according to plan. My first startup, we sold in a year and a half. My last startup, we sold in 1 year and a day, and we thought the next one, we got venture funding on day one, thinking, this is going to be the same type of story. And we spent probably a year pivoting. And as you're going through that, if there were no formalities kind of built into the system, people will think that, like everyone, it's open in renegotiation every single day you walk through that door. And you just cannot run a company that way because you have to be externally focused, not internally focused.
So this maybe pulls us forward to the practical issues of running a board meeting. So let's assume you got the formalities right for all the aforementioned reasons. You've gotten the governance right on top of the formality. It helps you recruit great board members. So now we assume you've got good board members. They have something to contribute. You've talked about alignment, so you're kind of pointing in the right direction. What does a good startup board meeting look like? I think I'll go to Clint and then Anthony. What's an actual good board meeting do?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'll describe a mediocre board meeting. So a mediocre board meeting, all the board members walk out and they say, boy, I am well informed. All right, that was a waste of time. All right, so I'd say a great board meeting is when the CEO walks out and says, boy, that was useful. I made progress with my company somehow. I got something figured out. I got a decision made. And so, by the way, this is very different than like in the public context. So in the public context, success is the board members walk out saying, I was well informed. Right? That's like the measure of success. So I'd say, that model just doesn't work in the startup world. And so, like I said, I'd focus on usefulness.
Right?
I would say, to add to that point, it was actually funny, the board meetings I attended when I was at CBS, when I attended, was mainly you did feel like you were going there more for the government's sakes, but there were no strategic discussions that really discussed because all the decisions had already been made. I would say that the key thing kind of going into running a board meeting, making sure it's successful, is going in with a mindset that you're having the board meeting to provide value and to help increase the success of the company. The board meeting really is about pushing the company along. It is not an operational update meeting. It's typically, you can't discuss more than 2 or 3 strategic items on the agenda, which I've seen sometimes where you go into a meeting like this, and where I've been a board member, and there's like 10 things the company wants to discuss. Nothing. You end up kind of discussing everything and making no decisions on anything. And I think that going in, it's really the responsibility of the CEO to set the expectation. That's the person that's accountable, and I would look at it if I was a CEO that what is a story that needs to happen, that needs to be interpreted. It's not a data dump either for the board members. It's really to get enough information out there and to tease it prior to the meeting so that you can have a strategic discussion for hopefully 3 to 4 hours on the outcome, the most important outcomes for your company.
So Bob, let me turn to you because everyone's kind of implied this. There's clearly some communications happening, maybe substantial communications happening outside the board meetings. So could you expand for us on the maintenance of the relationship with board members, the communication that occurs, and how that strategy feeds into this idea that when people arrive at the board meeting, they're not getting updated about here were sales these last 2 months, but instead they're talking strategically. How do you do that?
Well, so I don't view the board as just they bring value once every 6 weeks or 7 weeks. I mean, these are people that you're bringing in to your ecosystem to help you solve problems. So first, if you're not going to be intellectually honest with yourself, it's, the board's going to be your worst nightmare. But if you're honest, you realize you have problems, you realize you need additional help, no matter how much experience you have. 5 startups, there's a new problem that I've never seen before that comes in, and you want to get advice. So I tend to get together about every 2 weeks. Miriam's on my board, so and you get a chance to not only give updates, because you want the board members to have full context, but also here's my problem. I mean, it's great to talk about the good stuff, but here's the problem we're trying to solve, because as a startup, it's not been done before. So I'm having trouble here. Sales is slower than expected. We're not getting the university penetration. Why? And what you'll do is you'll find out that you get a good idea, and then you'll get another good idea, and sometimes that really forms some of the discussion that comes in at the board meeting. And then when you find the interesting chemistry of a good board, where people are starting to build up on other ideas. And again, the intellectual honesty is you're going to stand there and make sure that everybody's informed, but then the discussion kind of takes off. And that's where you leave a meeting going, wow, not only is this useful, boy, they're really smart. And that's when I view it as a great board meeting, because there's something that I couldn't have done by myself, nor could anybody on the team. And yet all this chemistry came together and really helped you make decisions that were beyond your own capability.
And I want to ask a related question to Miriam. It's something you mentioned to me, and I had shared kind of something that I had at LawLogix about that. This communication, which is coming, that Bob described, from the CEO to the board members, this dialogue, problem solving, focusing on issues. What about board members' desire, so non-CEO, so independent board members' desire to know more about the company? And should they only be allowed to talk to the CEO? Is there a best practice there? Can they reach down to a certain level within the company and get information directly? It sounds like a delicate matter to me. What do you recommend?
It's a very delicate matter in the sense that the CEO is trying to develop roles and responsibility within his team and kind of understand what everybody's doing and who kind of speaks on behalf of the company with respect to certain types of issues. And a board member, I do believe it's really good for board members to have relationships and to know the other members of the management team and to be able to have discussions with them. When I was in a startup in the 90s, I had quite a few discussions with one of the board members who was a certified public accountant by training, and I was acting as a CFO and putting together business plans and monthly reporting, and I found that to be extremely useful in both my kind of learning more about accounting in the real sense as opposed to what I learned in business school, and like managing cash flow and really understanding that we might be running into problems that I wouldn't have anticipated if I hadn't had those kind of conversations with the board member. But I think that the board member should address this directly with the CEO before he or she has these kinds of interactions, and understand that it is really best practice for a director to be able to have those kinds of discussions. And one of the reasons why directors are sometimes held liable for failing to have proper supervision is that they really don't know anything except what they're told at board meetings, and who knows if that's reflective of any reality, because they've never talked to anyone outside of a formal context. They've never had, visit to the office. Those are indications that your board is kind of asleep at the wheel and is actually not doing their job. So there's a good balance between trying to have interaction and trying to be respectful of the CEO and his role, and trying to figure out what's the best way for those communications to happen, but the CEO also understanding that he doesn't want a board that has no knowledge of his business except for what happens at a board meeting.
Sitting CEO.
Yeah, I would say I agree with that. And in fact, the formal process we have in our company is that we usually have the formalities. We have our quick team updates. My team leaves, and we have the formal strategic discussion. But at the end of every board meeting, the thing I found that has been helpful is if I actually leave the room and allow the board members to basically call in anyone inside the company at each board meeting in the company to basically have an open invite to take anyone they want to have that discussion or just talk among themselves about the job that I'm doing in the company. I think that setting it as a structure there has opened it up where it's a nice mechanism to actually force those discussions. And especially, there's discussions probably they want to have that I'm not in a room for.
In fact, I mean, this is one of the hardest things, I think, for younger or less experienced entrepreneurs. There's a certain amount of maturity and confidence that is required to be willing to allow your board to kind of function without you. But it shares best practices with the public board sphere, which is, one, board members should develop their own flows of information and not be solely dependent on information handed to them by the CEO. That's really good for everybody. And two, an executive session of sorts, you kind of described a hybrid, is always good, and implement it at every meeting, because you don't want to have the one meeting where they say, oh, by the way, we're going to have an executive session this time, and then you're like, really? Okay, that's scary. It's interesting, I'm going to mention a technique and see if you agree. The technique that we established now at LawLogix, it was mainly because of me, and I was the bad actor in this for a little while, accidentally, was that board members give a heads up to the CEO that they're engaging in these conversations, but otherwise the direct reports are all fair game, so long as heads up was given. And this was necessary in part because I stepped away as CEO and had CEO withdrawal, and I had instant messaging to everybody in the company. It took me a while to no longer just want to get my questions answered by pinging people directly, which, as you can imagine, for the sitting CEO is a bit discombobulating. But we came to terms, it's worked out, you give a heads up. Is that the method that you prefer? Literally the technical method you say to your board members, just give me a heads up, but here's who you can talk to? How do you do it?
Okay.
No, I don't really care. I mean, they should be able to talk to
Ping
anyone.
everybody? Okay, that's good. All right.
I think that I think the formal rules that I would set is anyone who's a direct report that can have direct access to. I think, they reach down, for instance, to a junior associate inside the company, it can be a big fear and it becomes kind of like a witch hunt. But definitely at the board meeting, setting some time aside so that we've created the norms at every meeting that they can reach out to any of my direct reports. And then that's an open invite outside the meeting that they can get more information.
Great. I think that's good tactical advice. Well, I want to switch now to do some Q&A for a little bit, and then we'll wrap up in the last 2 or 3 minutes with an open-ended question. So if anyone has any questions, please come up to the mic, because otherwise we won't capture it. We won't be able to hear it. You should... Normally, you'd be paying a lot of money to have this much talent on this side of the table assembled. So take advantage.
Hi, thanks for this. Has been really interesting. I'm Jessica Lesson. I'm a media entrepreneur and a reporter, but I'm just starting my new business, so I'm an entrepreneur. I was wondering the actual responsibilities legally of a startup board. So in public boards, we think of fiduciary responsibilities and looking out in the interest of all shareholders. On a private board, presumably, is it looking out for the preferred shareholders or themselves, or sort of what's that legal supervision role that even though it's sort of secondary to the guidance role, but I mean, what is it actually? Like, what is the board liable for and not liable for?
What a wonderful first question. Excellent. I'm going to maybe let Miriam take a stab at that first. Thank you.
Well, actually, there are not distinctions made between a private company board member and a public company board member in terms of the duties that they owe the company. So they would owe the same fiduciary duty to the company, a duty of loyalty, of opportunity. They would owe a duty of confidentiality to the company in exactly the same way that a public company director would. Now, I think that the realities are often that startup boards are much more complicated in the sense that directors sometimes have multiple relationships or advisory board member, and then they're also an investor, and there may be different relationships that they have that are slightly different from a prototypical public company director where, they have joined the board only after they have received a grant of stock and they have had not a prior relationship with the company in any official capacity. And so it can be more complicated because of that. And I think that typically requires that there be more disclosures from private directors actually than from public directors. So, for example, if you're a VC or you're an angel and you're invested in different kinds of companies, the information that you receive in one context may make it so that you should not be privy to information that's going on in this board meeting, and you may need to disclose that. One of your other companies is now in a potential competitive position, that one of your companies is on the other side of an acquisition offer. I mean, there's all sorts of different things that come up in this context that I think are a little bit more complicated than actually what typically happens in public company boards, where people are working in completely different industries from one another often, but the same duties apply to all directors.
In fact, I'll put in a little plug. The Rock Center is launching a new program called VC for DC. It's a Directors College for venture capitalists, and it's actually venture capitalists need as much education about this as anybody else. I think the bottom line is, as Miriam describes it, but the corporate opportunities in early stage companies are so dynamic. Unlike a very large company, it's kind of they do what they do, and if they're going to change direction, you're going to see it way ahead of time. But everything from pivots to rolling out new products creates these potentials for conflict. So I think it is something that requires more attention, and we'll be addressing it from the venture capitalist viewpoint, because I think they have as much responsibility, if not more so, in some ways, to be much more attentive to this. It's a big challenge, I think, in this space. Clint, you look like you had something to add to that.
Well, I just want to sort of I'll give you the sort of the scary scenario for liability on board of directors. So let's say you're not very careful, you're a startup, you're not very careful in your financials, and all of a sudden you run out of money. And you've got, a year and a half left on your lease. That's worth $150,000. You've got, $30,000 worth of legal bills. You've got vacation pay. And so you've got just, $200,000 or $300,000 worth of liabilities, and you have no money to pay it. Well, if the board members have acted badly, in the sense of maybe passed up an opportunity to sell the company a month before that would have paid all the bills, the board members can be personally liable for those outstanding expenses. Now, if there's a lawsuit in there, it gets even worse. But that's kind of the, that's sort of the risk that board members run with startup companies.
What if they agree to a sale that benefits shareholders who have themselves, right? Shareholders who have preferred rights, but maybe not employees because they're other kinds of shareholders. I guess you're just saying shareholder bases. Maybe there's no precedent around.
I'm going to repeat the question so we can get it. The question is, what if the board agrees to a sale, for example, that benefits the preferred shareholders perhaps because they have liquidation preferences, and then maybe leaves without any benefit, maybe zero, common shareholders, or you mentioned employees who have options. That's a complicated question. Maybe we'll give a very short answer, but there is emerging precedent. There are cases that are addressing this. We have minority common shareholders, and it's a very fast-moving space. One comment I'll give as the preliminary answer is that option holders, absent other rights, typically are not formally protected in this process, and the obligations of those option holders, they might be present from an ethics, moral viewpoint, but from a strict legal sense, it's less clear, if perhaps non-existent. But the common shareholders versus preferred and the sale, which leaves some empty-handed, that's very complicated. Miriam, if you want to do a minute's worth, it's great. If not, we'll probably do a whole session on that. Okay, I think that's a great question, and it's probably deserving of an entire panel because, as Clint points out, these are all over the place. Other questions? We'll do two, so you're each going to get a chance to ask a question. Let me have you go first, just because I like to alternate sides, and then we'll have you go second. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Cara Hollis. I'm a JD MBA. Jumping back to your point, you were saying, corporate boards are a little more diversified in terms of industry experience. But I think that oftentimes you see with startups that they can shift strategy very quickly and make forays into new industries and new areas. So how do you think about strategically forming your board so that you're nimble enough for this, or maybe it goes back to the time element you were talking about having the flexibility to bring in new board talent as the strategy shifts?
Great. Bob or Anthony, maybe?
Well, the first board member that I recruited was Miriam. And yet I wasn't going after the search business or anything else that were. You want to bring people that are incredibly smart and have incredibly broad context. And this way, when you're shifting and pivoting, you're going to be able to do that. And I don't know if I was in the food industry, maybe, my board would, but they're able to go in and handle any of the shifts that we're able to do. I mean, you don't want to get that person that has that one piece of expertise that if you pivot a little bit, their insight becomes valueless.
I mean, the early stage of a company, you're trying to find product market fit, and it's not about growth, it's trying to find product market fit. So ideally, I think the board member or the board members you try to recruit are people that have kind of a very wide lens. But in addition to that, I think that one of the key things to remember is keep board seats open. There's no reason to fill out all your board seats, what you need to fill out early until the product is figured out. Because if you do decide to pivot, it's much easier to work among a smaller team than it is to try to keep everyone on board and in sync about what you need to do. Because operationally, when you're pivoting, I can tell you, people can give you perspective, but the person accountable and responsible is the CEO. And so you can't blame it on a board member. I've heard so many times, my board made me do this or do that. At the end of the day, it's your responsibility. So it's important to kind of keep that board size small until you feel like that you have a product market fit and you're ready to run. And then at that time, I think it's easier to bring in people for the growth stages because you know what the company's going to be when it grows up.
And I think that's a really important point about the product market fit stage. And a lot of the times people will try to put somebody who's exactly an expert in a product in a similar industry on their board, but then they end up pivoting completely outside of that person's area of expertise, or that expertise is very valuable in the first couple of years, but not thereafter. And they don't necessarily have a bigger perspective to bring in terms of governance or business contacts or other kinds of experiences that they're going to help in building the company and financing the company over the term. And my sense is that a lot of the times, one, it's about relationship too. There's a lot of informal things that you can do. One, when you're talking with somebody who might be that sort of a person, you could have an advisor relationship with them as opposed to a fiduciary board relationship. You can talk with people about, if our company moves out of this area, are you willing to actually, move from the board so that we can bring on other people? And I think a lot of people are afraid to have these conversations up front, but the more that you actually have them and the more you build relationship with people, I have seen many people volunteer to be not on a board, for example, if their expertise is no longer valuable, because they had these kind of conversations informally with CEOs if they joined early, if the board feels like it's getting too big, if it feels like there are just better people that the company should be going after. These folks want to do a good job for the most part, and so and they are fiduciaries. That means they have to watch the company's interests ahead of their own, and if they understand that, they often are willing to volunteer to step down.
Just one thing to add is don't look at other companies that are about 4 stages ahead of you and what they have on their board and say, I need to have that board right now.
Last question.
So back to the question we're talking about drilling down in the organizations to get information. I sensed the discussion was that you basically did that during the days that the board met, okay? How do you feel about having directors coming in several times a year to informally talk with people lower than the management level, to talk to key people? For instance, if it's a scientific company, it might be the chief scientist there who normally doesn't interface with the board, in those types of situations.
I'm fine with it. I mean, I think if you're going to be a startup CEO, insecurity is not your best trait. So I think you have to just be willing to let people talk. You benefited from it. So first of all, if you're hiding something, that's not a winning situation anyway. I mean, you're going to have board members across. Our office is across the street. bunch of our board members and everything else are always around the Stanford campus. People are bumping into each other at lunch and everything else. I think those discussions benefit the company. I can't imagine a discussion that would now disruption. If you go too far down the organization, then there's that little bit of kind of witch hunt thought. But we made a very conscious effort. Everybody on my team has been through the board meetings, has been introduced to board members. They're comfortable. So I would not think twice if a board member called up and wanted to sit down and talk.
Clint, I've learned to read your expressions, so I'm going to jump in and let you go because you have something that you want to say.
Well, so I guess I just want to sort of like, I think if you change the question just a little bit, it gets in some ways more interesting. So board members coming in, it's a little bit of a fishing expedition or just getting information. I think a more interesting question is, when does the CEO proactively reach out to board members between meetings? So I'll give you, and by the way, I think probably more good CEOs get fired for screwing this up than just about anything else. So I'll give you an example. So you're thinking of firing your VP of engineering. Well, when do you tell your board members? I mean, do you tell them when you're thinking about it, i.e. they can influence you to not fire them? Do you tell them at sort of the next board meeting after you've already fired the VP of engineering? And by the way, if you get this wrong, you get fired.
I also just want to say from a staff development point of view, for a lot of your younger employees, the opportunity to meet your board members and to be in interaction with them and your management team is a real plus. So I think having, a happy hour where people are including board members or open houses, those kinds of things, it's a wonderful thing to do for your staff and to give them the opportunity to meet some of the people that are helping to build the company.
Yeah, one thing to watch out for, I'm a big advocate of being as transparent as possible, is making sure when you have junior members on your team that they realize that the company's not in trouble. And because otherwise, when you have a board member reaching out to anyone inside the company, so some of that can be alleviated or eliminated by making sure there's a lot of informal events where board members are included where they are part of the company. But if you only hold formal sessions, I think it's sometimes a little bit more challenging because it then, for people who are not exposed at the board meeting level, they are getting asked for questions they have no context on.
So we're out of time, but I'm going to take 2 minutes, give you about 30 seconds each. We'll go straight down the line, starting with Bob, to maybe give us one thing to do or not to do that you think maximizes an early stage entrepreneur's chance of assembling and running a great board.
I'll go back to the insecurity point. If you don't want to be intellectually honest with yourself, and if you really, you're going to make mistakes, and you're going to make them very, very, very public. Everybody knows when the CEO screws up. If that's an uncomfortable position, because you're going to do it multiple times during a company's life, it's probably not the right job for you. So I think the intellectual honesty, and nobody ever feels perfectly comfortable, but you have to recognize that you're going to have those moments that it just doesn't feel good. And if you start withdrawing and not communicating, boy, that's the beginning of the death spiral.
Good advice. Anthony?
I think it's being honest with yourself in terms as the CEO to know what your blind spots are, and then filling those out and going to every board meeting. Actually, it's with a mindset that you want to encourage debate and you want to question everything strategically. Actually walking out of a board meeting where there's no debate, you should question if the meeting was valuable at all. And I would try to focus and figure out when you're running these board meetings how to actually drive healthy debate, because otherwise you're not being honest with yourself and you're actually wasting a lot of time.
Right. Clint?
All right, so assuming you've got a good board meeting, good board members, two things to keep in mind is one is ownership. So I would say as a CEO, you've got to own the whole thing. So I've seen some CEOs say, oh, I've got these famous VCs and board members, so what should I do? That's like a disaster waiting to happen. We had one entrepreneur, by the way, that did this, completely knew his business, got these famous person on his board that had built $1 billion company, and they said, well, I did X, Y, and Z, and you only need to triple sales in the next year, not double sales. Well, he's like, oh, I need to triple sales. And for the next 6 months, really struggled. Then he came back and he finally got a backbone and said, no, we're in a business, we're going to double sales. I know my customers. And as soon as he did that, basically things went well. So I say you have to own the whole thing, and you got to have a backbone with these folks.
One thing that you mentioned was trying to get good debate, and I'm a big proponent of having diverse boards as a way of doing that. Professor McNeil in the business school has done research on diverse boards. And one of the things that happens in diversity is that everyone does not assume that everyone thinks exactly as they do. And because of that, they tend to prepare more for board meetings, and they tend to have more rich discussions. Because when you have kind of a social club atmosphere around your board where people think, well, I know exactly their politics, their religion, their golf club, etc., that is often a recipe where people are just involved in groupthink. And when they understand, oh, there may be people with different professions, different ethnic groups, different genders, they understand just from that visible diversity that they will not necessarily all have the same way of thinking about everything, and they will actually, the research shows they'll actually prepare more carefully their thought process around major decisions for your company.
Well, with that, I think we're going to wrap it up, and please help me give a round of applause to our panelists.